Most people think exhaustion is just a personal problem, a result of long days, too much work, too little sleep, stress, responsibilities, life moving too fast. But what if exhaustion isn't only a condition? What if it's also a state where control becomes easier? Not obvious control, not force, not someone telling you what to do. Something quieter than that. Because the truth is, a tired mind doesn't operate the same way as a rested one. And systems that understand human behavior have always known this. Exhaustion changes how people think, how they react, how deeply they question things, and most importantly, how much resistance they have left. When the brain is overloaded, it starts searching for shortcuts, quick answers, simple decisions, less conflict, less thinking. Not because someone is weak, but because the mind is trying to conserve energy. Psychologists sometimes refer to this as cognitive depletion. When mental energy drops, the brain becomes less willing to challenge information, less willing to analyze deeply, less willing to push back. And that small shift changes everything. Because influence becomes easier when people stop questioning the environment around them. Think about the moments when you feel the most mentally drained. Late at night, after a long day, when too many things are happening at once, during periods of uncertainty, during stress, during constant pressure to keep moving. In those moments, the brain isn't focused on control or strategy. It's focused on survival. Finishing the day, getting through the moment, reducing friction wherever possible. And this is where subtle influence begins to work more effectively. Not because someone planned it specifically for you, but because exhausted minds behave in predictable ways. They avoid complexity. They follow the easiest path. They accept suggestions faster. They delay resistance. This is one reason modern environments are filled with constant stimulation, notifications, deadlines, endless information, continuous decisions. None of these things seem connected at first, but together they create a state of mental noise, and mental noise slowly drains attention. Once attention drops, awareness drops with it, and when awareness drops, influence becomes quieter and easier to insert. This doesn't mean someone is directly controlling people through exhaustion. It's more subtle than that. Systems that benefit from attention simply keep attention occupied. Always something to check. Always something to respond to. Always something demanding focus. Over time, the mind stops resting properly, even when the body is still. This creates a condition where people feel tired, but continue moving through information environments anyway. And that's where decisions begin shifting. Because decision-making requires energy. Evaluating options takes effort. Questioning narratives takes effort. Slowing down takes effort. But exhaustion removes the desire to do those things. The brain starts preferring automatic responses. Scrolling instead of thinking, following suggestions instead of searching deeply, accepting what appears first, ignoring what requires more attention. This is how influence becomes quiet, not through pressure, through convenience. But there's another layer to this dynamic that most people never consider. Exhaustion also affects emotional regulation. When someone is mentally drained, their emotional reactions change. Small frustrations feel bigger. Uncertainty feels heavier. Negative information feels more impactful. And emotionally charged content becomes more noticeable, which means the type of information people react to shifts. Calm analysis becomes less attractive. Strong emotional signals become easier to engage with. This creates an environment where emotionally intense messages travel further, spread faster, hold attention longer, and systems that measure engagement learn this quickly. Over time, they begin amplifying what works, not intentionally manipulating people, but optimizing for response. And response is easier to trigger in exhausted minds. This is why periods of collective stress often change how information spreads. When large groups of people feel overwhelmed, uncertain, or tired, their decision-making patterns shift together. And once patterns shift at scale, influence becomes more powerful, because people start relying on signals from their environment rather than deep analysis. Trends, popular opinions, visible reactions, social proof. Anything that reduces the need to think too hard. Now imagine this happening continuously. Not for a day, not for a week, but for months or years. Slowly, people adapt to operating in a state of low mental energy. They move faster through information, react faster, question less frequently, not because they don't care, but because the environment demands constant attention. And constant attention drains the mind. But the most interesting part of this entire system is something subtle. Exhausted people often don't realize how tired their thinking has become. They notice physical fatigue, but mental fatigue hides behind routine behavior. Scrolling, responding, working, consuming information, repeating the same patterns daily. It feels normal. But normal doesn't always mean neutral. Sometimes normal environments shape behavior in ways people don't notice. For example, when people are rested, they are more likely to challenge ideas, ask questions, compare information sources, pause before reacting. But when people are exhausted, speed replaces depth, and speed favors whatever appears first, whatever looks easiest, whatever reduces effort. This is where positioning becomes powerful. The first headline seen, the first video suggested, the first opinion visible in a discussion, small placements, large psychological impact. Because the brain often accepts the first available answer when energy is low. This is known as cognitive shortcutting, and it happens far more often than people realize, especially in environments filled with constant information. But exhaustion also changes something else. Motivation to resist. When someone feels mentally strong, they are more willing to disagree, to question, to stand apart from the group. But when someone is drained, they prefer stability. Less conflict, less friction. Which means they are more likely to align with what appears common or accepted. Not out of agreement, but out of reduced resistance. And systems that understand human behavior recognize this pattern clearly. Influence doesn't need to overpower people. It just needs to meet them when their resistance is lowest. And exhaustion naturally lowers resistance, quietly, gradually, almost invisibly. This doesn't mean every environment is intentionally designed to exhaust people, but environments built around constant engagement often produce that outcome naturally. Attention becomes the most valuable resource, and the longer people stay engaged, the more exhausted their decision-making becomes, which creates a cycle. Engagement leads to fatigue. Fatigue leads to easier influence. Easier influence increases engagement further, and the cycle continues. But awareness changes this dynamic, because once someone begins recognizing how exhaustion affects their thinking, they start noticing when decisions feel rushed, when information feels overwhelming, when attention feels scattered, and that awareness interrupts the automatic process. Not completely, but enough to slow things down, because control systems rely on speed and distraction. But awareness introduces pause, and pause changes decision-making. The truth is, exhaustion alone doesn't control people, but it changes the conditions where influence happens. It lowers the barriers that normally protect independent thinking. It reduces the energy needed to question the environment. And once those barriers drop, direction becomes easier to shape. Quietly, subtly, without anyone announcing it. Most people will continue moving through modern environments without thinking about this. They'll feel tired, but assume it's just part of life, part of work, part of daily routines. And maybe sometimes it is. But sometimes exhaustion is more than just fatigue. Sometimes it's the state where influence works best. And once you start noticing that connection, you begin paying attention differently. Not just to information, but to your own mental energy. Because control rarely begins with force. It begins when people are too tired to notice it,